My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am 28 years old. 48 hours ago, my biological father looked at me across a polished marble desk and fired me from the corporate empire my grandmother built, telling me it looked bad for the newly appointed CEO's sister to be a corporate secretary. He told me some children are born to lead, and others are born to take notes. He handed me a standard severance package, told me my clearance was revoked, and had security escort me out of the building. But yesterday morning, during an emergency session of the board of directors, I walked back through those double glass doors, slid a notarized stack of legal trust agreements across the table, and took my seat at the head of the boardroom as the company's new majority shareholder. Before we get into the full story of how a single corporate restructuring notice pulled the rug out from under a $90 million dynasty, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly connects with you. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know where you are listening from right now. Now, let me take you back to the winter of 2011, to a cold, drafting dining room in upstate New York, and the exact moment I realized that in the Mitchell family, love was a ledger that only balanced for one child. Growing up, the house on Harrison Boulevard was old money Manhattan transported to a suburban estate. My father, Julian Mitchell, ran Mitchell Global Enterprises, a commercial real estate and development firm that my grandmother, Evelyn Mitchell, had founded in 1968 out of a tiny single-room brick office in Queens. By the time I was a teenager, the company held over 24 commercial properties across the state, valued at just over $92 million. My father wore authority like a second skin, judging humanity purely by titles, tax brackets, and academic credentials. He was a man who didn't speak to people. He issued decrees, and his golden child was my older sister, Amanda. Amanda was 3 years older than me, born with my mother's piercing blue eyes, striking blonde hair, and a natural, unshakable confidence that my parents adored. She was a performer from the womb, a straight-A student, student council president, and the kind of girl who could charm a room full of seasoned executives at a charity gala before she was even old enough to drive. My parents, Julian and Evelyn, viewed Amanda as the living proof of their own genetic perfection. Every dollar, every ounce of attention, and every family resource was funneled into her path. I was the quiet one. I was born with dyslexia, a severe reading disorder that wasn't properly diagnosed until I was nearly 9 years old. To me, letters on a page didn't stay still. They swam, mirrored, and rearranged themselves into impossible puzzles that left me sweating and trembling in my chair during elementary school spelling bees. While my sister was being accelerated into advanced preparatory tracking, my mother would look at my report cards with a heavy, performative sigh. "Sarah, we've already spent thousands on reading consultants," she would say, her voice dripping with a soft, clinical disappointment that cuts deeper than anger. "At some point, we just have to accept that some children are academic, and others are simply built for a quiet, supportive life. You're good at adapting, sweetie. Don't worry about the big things." I was 12 when I believed her. I was 12 when I accepted the narrative that I was the slow one, the defective spare tire in the Mitchell machine. While Amanda received private violin lessons from Juilliard instructors and $300 an hour SAT prep with Ivy League consultants, I was left to figure out my education on my own. But rejection does something strange to a child. It forces you to build alternative survival mechanisms. Because standard text was a minefield, I learned to process the world visually. I trained myself to memorize layouts, to map out concepts using flowcharts and structural diagrams, and to read people's microexpressions because I couldn't rely on their written words. And every Sunday afternoon, when the isolation in my own home became too heavy to breathe, I would take the local transit train down to my grandmother Evelyn's apartment on the Upper West Side. Evelyn Mitchell was a force of nature. She was 82 then, a self-made woman who had broken into the cutthroat New York real estate market back when women weren't even allowed to have their own credit cards without a male cosigner. She had built Mitchell Global brick by brick, dealing with concrete unions, crooked city inspectors, and patronizing bankers with a steel spine covered in silk. Her apartment smelled of old parchment, black coffee, and lavender water. She didn't have a television. She had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a large walnut desk covered in blueprints and old corporate charters. "Sarah," she told me one afternoon, her weathered, ink-stained hand covering my trembling fingers as I struggled to read an old lease agreement out loud. "Your father reads documents like a bureaucrat. He looks for what he can exploit. But you see patterns, child. You see where the lines connect and where the foundation sags. That's not a disability. That is architecture. Never let a man with a degree tell you you're blind just because you don't look at the world through his glasses." I didn't fully understand what she meant back then. I thought she was just being kind, trying to patch up the bruised ego of a granddaughter who spent her dinners listening to her family talk over her. But Evelyn was doing something else entirely. During those long Sunday afternoons, she didn't teach me how to read novels. She taught me how to read structures. She would lay out complicated corporate balance sheets and corporate bylaws from the company's early days, showing me how holding companies were nested, how voting rights were distributed, and how legal entities could protect or destroy human effort. To my visual brain, those complex legal networks made perfect sense. I didn't see text, I saw a framework. Then came Christmas Eve of 2016. It was the annual Mitchell holiday dinner at our estate, a catered affair for 30 extended relatives, business partners, and local politicians. The dining room was dazzling, crystal chandeliers casting sharp light across a mahogany table, sterling silver service, and an atmosphere thick with performative perfection. My father stood at the head of the table, his wine glass raised, his voice carrying the deep boardroom resonance he used to close multi-million-dollar land acquisitions. "I'd like to make an announcement," my father said, beaming with an intense, unbridled pride. "My eldest daughter, Amanda, has officially graduated top of her class from Yale Law, and this morning she accepted a position as a senior associate at Sullivan and Cromwell. She is the future of this family, and she is the future of Mitchell Global Enterprises." To Amanda. The room erupted. Glasses clinked, aunts dabbed their eyes, and Uncle Richard clapped Amanda on the shoulder as she blushed with practiced, corporate modesty. My mother looked at her like she was a god descended from heaven. Then, as the applause died down, my father's gaze drifted down the long table. His eyes passed over the silver centerpieces, past the local councilman, and finally landed on me, sitting quietly at the edge of the kids' seating section. The warmth completely evaporated from his face, replaced by a flat, indifferent neutrality. "And Sarah," my father added, his tone dropping into a patronizing register that made a few relatives chuckle softly. "Well, Sarah is also here with us tonight, keeping us grounded." It was a casual, public slaughter masked as a holiday toast. Amanda didn't defend me. She simply took a sip of her Pinot Noir and smiled for a relative's phone camera. I stared down at my plate, the roasted venison blurring through the hot tears I absolutely refused to let fall in front of that room. Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, a hand found mine. It was thin, paper-skinned, but its grip was shockingly firm. My grandmother, Evelyn, seated directly across from me despite her failing health, squeezed my fingers with an intense, fierce energy. When I looked up, her sharp gray eyes weren't focused on me. They were locked onto her son Julian, and they held an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't say a single word that night. But 3 weeks later, she called me to her apartment on a rainy Tuesday afternoon and handed me a small, heavy mahogany box with solid brass hinges and a digital security latch. "Keep this safe, Sarah," she whispered, her voice carrying the rasp of a woman who knew her lungs were giving out. "Don't open it yet. Don't show your father, don't tell your sister. When the day comes that Julian finally shows you exactly who he is, you will press your thumb to this lock, and you will understand why I built this company." Evelyn passed away 14 months later from pancreatic cancer. I was the only family member sitting in that quiet hospice room holding her hand when the monitor finally went flat on a Sunday morning in April. My father and Amanda were at a commercial real estate convention in Chicago, closing a deal on an office park. They didn't cancel their flights for the funeral. They simply rescheduled the memorial service for a date that didn't conflict with the corporate calendar. The mahogany box stayed tucked in the bottom drawer of my bedroom dresser, buried beneath old winter sweaters. its brass hinges cold and silent. By 2024, I had graduated from a quiet state college with a degree in business administration. I didn't have an Ivy League pedigree, and my resume didn't gleam with corporate honors, but I had spent years mastering database management, visual analytics, and corporate filing systems. I wanted to contribute to the company my grandmother built. I wanted to see if there was a place for me within the family legacy, a way to bridge the chasm between myself and my father. My father agreed to hire me. He assigned me to the administrative support pool at Mitchell Global Tower on the 14th floor. My title was Senior Administrative Assistant, though in reality, I was a glorified corporate secretary. My salary was $45,000 a year. That exact same month, Amanda joined the firm as Chief Legal Counsel, moving into a corner office on the 40th floor with a starting salary of $280,000 plus performance bonuses. My daily job consisted of photocopying 600-page environmental assessments, booking 5-star conference rooms for executives who looked through me like glass, and retrieving triple-shot macchiatos for project managers who didn't know my last name. I was never invited to a strategy session, never carbon copied on an acquisition email, and never permitted to speak during departmental briefings. But because I was the secretary, I was invisible, and because I was invisible, I saw everything. People do not hide things from the person running the copy machine. Executives discuss hostile takeovers in the hallway while you're clearing paper jams. Project managers leave draft contracts on the glass of the scanner. For 2 years, as the pages slid through my fingers, my visual memory recorded every layout, every financial discrepancy, and every pattern in the firm's major developments. While my father and sister were busy playing corporate royals on the top floors, I was mapping the true architecture of Mitchell Global Enterprises from the basement up. Then came last Tuesday morning, July 1st. The email arrived in my inbox at 4:15 p.m., just as the administrative staff was packing up for the day. The subject line was flat, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. Internal restructuring notice, confidential. Dear Ms. Mitchell ***, as part of our ongoing organizational optimization and the transition of executive leadership to our incoming CEO, your current position within the administrative pool will be eliminated effective July 15th. Human Resources will contact you regarding your severance options and outstanding vacation payout. We thank you for your service. I sat at my cubicle desk for 5 full minutes, watching the letters swim and rearrange themselves on the glowing monitor. They were firing me. Through the glass partition that separated my support desk from the executive elevator bank, I saw my father and Amanda walking toward his private corner office. They were laughing, their heads bent together over a leather-bound folder. I didn't pack my bag. I stood up, walked down the marble corridor, and pushed through the double oak doors of my father's office without knocking. My father was sitting behind his minimalist glass desk, a fountain pen in his hand. Amanda was leaning against the window sill, a sparkling water in her hand, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. They both looked up as I entered, their expressions instantly turning into identical masks of mild irritation. "Sarah," my father said, his voice dropping into that familiar boardroom rumble. "We're in the middle of reviewing the third quarter projections. Talk to the floor manager if you need supplies." "I don't need supplies, Julian," I said, setting my employee ID badge down on the glass desk with a sharp click. "I just received a termination notice from HR. My position has been eliminated." Amanda took a slow sip of her water, her expression completely smooth, completely detached. "It's an organizational optimization, Sarah. The board approved the new efficiency metrics last month." "You're the chief legal counsel, Amanda," I said, looking directly into my sister's cold blue eyes. "And you're taking over as CEO next month. Did you draft this notice?" My father stood up, slowly buttoning his bespoke suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs with an institutional calmness that made my skin crawl. "Don't take this personally, Sarah," he said, walking around the desk until he was standing 3 feet from me. "The truth is, it looks bad for the incoming CEO's sister to be a secretary. Mitchell Global is a premium brand. We are under intense scrutiny from our institutional investors, and we are preparing a major public offering for the autumn. Having family members scattered in low-level administrative roles creates a narrative of nepotism without competence. It looks messy. It looks weak. Messy, I repeated, my voice tight, my hands clenched at my sides. I've worked 45 hours a week here for 2 years. I've processed every single lease agreement for the Queen's portfolio. I'm not asking for a corner office, Dad. I'm asking for my job. And I'm telling you that you don't fit the strategic profile of this leadership transition, my father said, his face hardening, the polite mask completely dissolving. Some children are born to lead empires, Sarah, and others are simply built for the background. We've given you a generous 12-week severance. Use it to find something more suited to your specific pace. But your clearance in this tower ends at 5:00 p.m. today. I looked at my father, the man who had erased me from his holiday toasts, the man who had looked at my childhood struggles and decided I was an embarrassment to his brand. Then I looked at Amanda, who was already looking back down at her leather-bound folder, having completely dismissed my existence before I had even left the room. "Suit yourself, Julian," I said softly, "but you should have checked the foundation before you pulled the support beams." I walked out of the office, down the elevator, and straight out into the humid Manhattan evening. I didn't cry on the train ride back to my small studio apartment in Brooklyn. The time for tears had ended years ago under a crystal chandelier. When I got home, I walked straight to my bedroom dresser, pulled open the bottom drawer, and retrieved the heavy mahogany box my grandmother had left me. I placed my thumb against the brass security pad. The scanner glowed red, then green, and with a soft, hydraulic click, the lid popped open. Inside lay 3 bound documents, stamped with a federal legal seal from 2019, a heavy silver signet ring bearing the original Queen's office logo, and a modern encrypted flash drive labeled simply, "The Real Estate." I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The first document that opened was a master trust agreement titled the Evelyn Mitchell Heritage Trust. I began to read, my visual brain tracking the legal diagrams, the entity allocations, and the specific conditional covenants my grandmother had drafted with her attorneys 5 months before she died. And as the structural lines connected on my screen, a cold smile finally spread across my face. My father and sister had just spent the last 48 hours celebrating their new executive transition. They had no idea that the entire $90 million empire was sitting on a legal fault line, and I was about to trigger the tremor. I spent the rest of Tuesday night staring at the glowing monitor of my laptop, watching 28 years of family lies crumble into a beautiful, undeniable lattice of legal text. The file my grandmother Evelyn had left behind was not just a trust document. It was a master blueprint of her foresight. She had known my father Julian precisely. She had known that his vanity, his rigid focus on credentials, and his complete lack of structural foresight would eventually lead him to exploit or discard anything he didn't view as part of his premium brand. According to the Master Trust Agreement of the Evelyn Mitchell Heritage Trust *, which was signed and finalized on September 12, 2019. My grandmother had never actually passed her founding corporate shares into the general probate estate when she died. My father believed he had inherited 51% of Mitchell Global Enterprises through her standard will. He had spent the last 5 years voting those shares, signing development deals, and projecting himself as the absolute ruler of the firm. But the paperwork in my hands told a completely different story. The 2019 trust agreement established that 51% of the total voting shares in Mitchell Global Enterprises were held permanently by the Heritage Trust. My grandmother had designated Julian as a temporary managing trustee with conditional voting power that remained valid *ONLY, as long as the corporate governance of the firm didn't violate the specific family protection covenants she had written into the framework. And Clause 9 of that agreement was the absolute tripwire. It was written in clean, unyielding legal prose. In the event that Julian Mitchell or any designated successor executes a bad faith termination, systemic marginalization, or formal corporate erasure of any immediate blood descendant of Evelyn Mitchell, without explicit, unanimous board approval and independent legal audit, the temporary managing trusteeship shall immediately fail. Control, along with full voting rights of the 51% majority shares, shall instantly transfer to the designated successor beneficiary, Sarah Ann Mitchell. My father had fired me at 4:15 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon to clean up his corporate image for the autumn public offering. By doing so without a full board vote or an independent legal audit, he hadn't just removed a secretary from the 14th floor. He had automatically stripped himself of his own throne. Legally, the moment that termination notice hit my inbox, the temporary trusteeship failed. The vault had opened, and the keys had already dropped into my hands. At 2:14 a.m., I called Jonathan ELLAS, using the private cell number my grandmother had taped to the inside lid of the mahogany box. Jonathan was 64 years old, a legendary Manhattan estate attorney who had served as Evelyn's personal legal counsel for over 3 decades. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp, alert, and entirely devoid of sleep, as if he had been sitting by his phone for 5 years waiting for this exact call. "Sarah," Jonathan said, the barest hint of a satisfied rumble in his deep voice. "I received an automated filing alert from the state corporate registry 45 minutes ago. Your employee termination record was uploaded into the system by Mitchell Global's HR department." "They fired me, Jonathan," I said, my voice steady, my visual memory tracking the layout of the trust document on my screen. "Julian told me some children are born to lead and others are born to take notes. He said having his sister look like a secretary creates a narrative of weakness." "Julian always was blind to the stones that hold up his own walls," Jonathan said, the sound of papers rustling through the line. "I have the certified copies of the trust execution, the state registry notifications, and the original board bylaws ready. Your grandmother gave me explicit instructions. The moment Julian executed the erasure, I was to trigger the emergency board activation. I've already dispatched a formal petition to the board secretary. The emergency session is locked for Thursday morning at 10:00 a.m. on the 42nd floor of Mitchell Global Tower." 48 hours, I whispered. "Exactly 48 hours from your termination," Jonathan confirmed. "They have no idea what has hit them. AMANDA has spent the evening reviewing her speech for the Executive Transition Gala. I suggest you get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow, we prepare the architecture for the boardroom. Your grandmother always said you read structures like an architect. On Thursday, you're going to show them how a house falls when the foundation shifts." Wednesday morning was a slow, suffocating exercise in psychological warfare. I stayed in my apartment, watching the rain streak down my single window, tracking the internal corporate network through the secure backup link I still had active on my personal tablet. At 10:00 a.m., an all-staff memorandum was broadcast across the entire Mitchell Global network. It was signed by my father. Internal executive transition, preparing for the future. Effective August 1st, AMANDA Mitchell, JD, will formally assume the role of Chief Executive Officer. As we prepare for our upcoming public offering, we are optimizing our organizational framework across all levels to ensure premium operational standards. We thank our departing administrative staff for their contributions. They didn't even use my name. I was just a line item, an invisible speck of dust swept out of the way so the golden child could take the stage under the crystal chandeliers. My mother called me at 2:00 p.m. Her voice carried that high, practiced, performative warmth she used when she was trying to manage an unpleasant social situation before it became gossip. "Sarah, sweetie," my mother said, the clinking of a silver spoon against a porcelain teacup audible in the background. "Your father told me about the restructuring. I know you're probably feeling a bit hurt, but you must understand this is purely a business decision. AMANDA has worked so hard for her Yale degree, and the firm is under tremendous pressure from the institutional investors. Having you there in that small pool, it just created an awkward dynamic for the family image. We want what's best for you, Sarah. Your father is willing to extend your severance to 16 weeks if you sign the standard non-disclosure release tomorrow." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the master trust agreement printed and laid out on my small kitchen table. Purely business, I repeated, my voice flat, entirely devoid of the tears my mother was undoubtedly expecting to manage. Yes, exactly, she said, exhaling a sigh of relief through the line. I knew you'd understand. We can't have any family drama clouding Amanda Aquotest transition dinner on Friday night at the plaza. It's her night, Sarah. We need to present a united, flawless front to the press. Don't worry about the united front, Mom, I said softly, my fingers tracing the silver signet ring of my grandmother that sat on the table. The dynamic is going to change completely by Friday. Tell Julian I received his efficiency metrics. I'll be sure to bring my notes. She hung up, entirely satisfied that the quiet, slow daughter had been successfully managed, compartmentalized, and silenced with a 12-week bribe. She had no idea that her perfect, flawless front was already standing on 12 tons of structural dynamite. By late Wednesday afternoon, the cracks began to widen beneath the executive suite. Amanda discovered the emergency board notification. She called me at 4:45 p.m., her composure completely cracked, her voice tight with a cold, controlled fury that sounded like broken glass. What did you do, Sarah? Amanda hissed, the ambient noise of her high-end corner office completely absent, meaning she had locked herself in her private bathroom or conference space to make the call. Our legal department just received an automated docket entry from Jonathan Ellis. There's an emergency board session scheduled for tomorrow morning. Margaretcoleman and 2 senior directors signed the petition. Why is Evelyn Quotes, old lawyer, involved in internal human resources optimization? Margaretcoleman has been a director on that board for 32 years, Amanda, I said, keeping my voice level, rhythmic, and entirely clinical. She built half of the Queen's commercial portfolio with Grandma in the 70s. Maybe she has questions about how the firm's leadership is being managed. Don't play these pathetic, passive-aggressive games with me, Sarah, Amanda snapped, her breath sharp through the phone. If you're trying to cause a scene because you're jealous of my appointment, you're only embarrassing yourself. You work in the copy room. You process invoices. You don't even understand the basic corporate bylaws of a holding company. I am the chief legal counsel, and I've personally reviewed the executive transition parameters. Your termination was entirely within standard operating procedure. I know the operating procedure, Amanda, I said, a small, cold smile finally touching my lips. I've PHOTOCOPIED every line of it for 2 years, but you should have spent less time admiring your Ivy League diploma and more time reading the underlying trust covenants that fund your salary. I'll see you tomorrow at 10:00 a.m. Make sure you bring a copy of my restructuring notice. I'd hate for the board to miss the exact wording. She cut the line without saying goodbye. 20 minutes later, through the remote corporate log I was still watching, I saw my father's executive assistant flag, a flurry of urgent internal emails between the executive suite and their primary corporate defense firm. They were panicking, but they were panicking about the wrong threat. They assumed Margaret Coleman was staging a minority shareholder revolt over the upcoming public offering metrics. They assumed the danger was an old woman with a grudge against modern development strategies. They had completely forgotten the secretary they had thrown out 48 hours ago. That night, the anxiety tried to creep into my chest. I sat on my bed, the heavy mahogany box open beside me, the silver signet ring heavy on my middle finger. I thought about what would happen when I walked into that boardroom. I thought about the sheer institutional weight of my father's authority, the razor-sharp legal intellect of my sister, and the decades of absolute certainty that my family held regarding my insignificance. If I let my hand shake, if I stumbled over a single sentence, if my dyslexia tripped me up while reading the legal provisions, they would turn me into a laughing stock before the board. They would weaponize my childhood failures against me, label me a troubled, vengeful child acting out of sibling jealousy, and have security remove me before Jonathan could even open his briefcase. I picked up my phone and called Dr. Hayes, the therapist who had helped me navigate the long, suffocating shadow of my family dynamic since my early 20s. "Sarah," Dr. Hayes said gently, after I had laid out the timeline of the upcoming confrontation. "You are entering that room with an architectural reality. Your father and sister have spent 28 years defining you by your limitations because it made their narrative easier to maintain. They needed you to be the slow one so they could look flawless. But boundaries are not an act of vengeance, Sarah. They are an act of truth. You are not going there to change their minds about you. You are going there to establish the reality of what your grandmother built. Let the paperwork do the work. You don't need to yell to be heard when the foundation is entirely on your side." I hung up, her words settling into my bones like frost. Clean, cold, and stabilizing. I looked at the 3 copies of the trust agreement Jonathan had prepared. I practiced reading the primary active clauses out loud in the dark, forcing my eyes to track the block text by mapping the words as a continuous visual system rather than a sequence of letters. I didn't sleep more than 2 hours, but when the alarm finally went off at 7:00 a.m. on Thursday morning, I didn't feel tired. I felt completely emptied of fear. The time for seeking their validation had ended the moment the security guard pushed the turnstile behind me on Tuesday afternoon. Thursday, July 3rd, 9:45, Mitchell Global Tower. The glass facade of the building gleamed like a silver needle against the gray Manhattan sky as the local transit train dropped me off at the corner of 42nd Street. I wore a tailored slate-gray blazer that belonged to my roommate. It was 2 sizes too large for me, the sleeves slightly long, but it felt like armor. In my right hand, I carried a cheap leather portfolio I had bought at a Goodwill donation shop for $12. Inside were the 3 copies of the True Will and Trust Declaration. I entered the grand marble lobby, walked straight to the executive elevator banks, and slid my old administrative ID badge across the security scanner. The scanner buzzed sharp and red. Access denied. Clearance revoked. The security guard behind the polished granite desk, a man named Marcus, whom I had brought coffee to every Friday morning for 24 months, looked up with a deep, conflicted frown. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Marcus whispered, looking around the crowded lobby before lowering his voice. "The floor manager uploaded the security block yesterday morning. Your father's office gave explicit instructions. You're not permitted on the upper floors." Before I could answer, a cool, authoritative voice cut through the ambient echo of the lobby. "He has standing, officer," Jonathan Ellis said, stepping out from behind a marble pillar. He looked immaculate, a tailored navy pinstripe suit, a silver-headed cane that belonged to his grandfather, and a leather briefcase that carried the seal of the New York State Surrogates Court. Beside him stood Margaret Coleman, her silver hair styled in a tight, elegant bob, her sharp eyes fixed on the security guard with the absolute confidence of a woman who had signed the building's original construction loans. "Miss Mitchell is an invited participant in the emergency board session under Section 14 of the corporate bylaws," Margaret said, sliding her own gold director's badge across the granite counter. "Authorize her clearance immediately, or I will call a formal recess in the lobby with the legal press on speakerphone." Marcus didn't hesitate. He bypassed the floor manager's block, swiped a master credential, and handed me an executive visitor's pass with a trembling hand. The elevator ride up to the 42nd floor was completely silent. The digital floor indicator climbed through the numbers, 14, 20, 30, 40, the air pressure dropping slightly, my heart rate remaining perfectly flat. I watched my reflection in the brushed steel wall of the elevator. I didn't look like the secretary who had been escorted out 48 hours ago. I looked like the architect who had come to collect the deed. The elevator doors glided open onto the 42nd floor, revealing a reception area covered in Italian travertine marble and floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over Central Park. Standing by the entrance to the main boardroom, flanked by 2 senior vice presidents, was my sister Amanda. She looked magnificent, a tailored emerald power suit, a Cartier bracelet gleaming on her left wrist, and her blonde hair pinned back with clinical perfection. Her eyes narrowed to blue slits as she saw me step out of the elevator between Jonathan and Margaret. "Sarah," Amanda said, a sharp, performative laugh breaking through her lips as she stepped forward to block our path. "What is this ridiculous spectacle? This is a closed executive session regarding the firm's capitalization metrics. You don't have clearance to be on this floor, let alone in this hallway. Security is already on their way up to remove you. I have the clearance of 51% of the underlying equity of this firm, Amanda, I said, looking directly into my sister's flawless face without blinking. I suggest you open the door. We're on a very tight schedule, and your transition parameters are about to face an efficiency metric you didn't account for. Before she could respond, the heavy walnut doors of the boardroom swung open, and my father, Julian Mitchell, stepped out into the corridor. His face was flushed a dangerous, mottled purple, his tie slightly askew, a stack of legal correspondence clutched in his right hand. "What is the meaning of this, Margaret?" Julian roared, completely ignoring me as he glared at Margaret Coleman. "You've completely disrupted our third-quarter audit tracking for a stunt. Sarah has been separated from the firm under standard HR optimization. She is no longer an employee of Mitchell Global Enterprises." Margaret Coleman smiled, a slow, terrifying expression of pure, institutional disregard. "She isn't an employee, Julian," Margaret said softly, gesturing toward the open boardroom table where 9 other board members were already seated in high-backed leather chairs, watching the corridor through the glass walls. "She's your new boss. Let's go inside. The meeting is officially called to order." The boardroom was an oval chamber of polished walnut and brushed steel, dominated by an immense glass table that mirrored the gray Manhattan sky outside. 12 high-backed leather chairs were arranged around it, occupied by the institutional investors, senior directors, and founders who held the fate of Mitchell Global Enterprises in their hands. Above the polished limestone fireplace hung a massive oil portrait of my grandmother, Evelyn Mitchell, her painted gray eyes seeming to look down from the frame with a sharp, knowing intensity. I walked to the absolute foot of the table and pulled out a chair. I didn't wait for my father to speak, nor did I look at Amanda, who had taken her seat to Julian's right, the traditional positioning of the heir apparent. Jonathan Ellis remained standing directly behind me, his heavy leather briefcase resting on the walnut surface like a weapon. Robert Hartley, the board chairman, a distinguished man in his late 60s who had served alongside my grandmother since the firm's inception, called the room to order with a sharp click of his pen against his water glass. "This emergency session has been formally convened under Section 14 of the corporate bylaws," Hartley announced, his eyes moving across the table before settling directly on me. "The petition was filed by Director Coleman, Director Holloway, and Director Parker. Julian, you and legal counsel have the floor to address the preliminary filing." My father stood up immediately, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket with a theatrical, slow deliberation designed to project complete command over the room. He didn't look at me. He looked over my head, addressing the directors with the smooth, patronizing warmth he used to placate difficult shareholders. "Thank you, Robert," Julian said, his boardroom rumble echoing off the glass panels. "Before we allow this session to devolve into an unfortunate family spectacle, I want to provide some necessary context for the board. What we are witnessing today is a troubled, deeply resentful young woman acting out because of an internal administrative optimization." Amanda chimed in, her voice dripping with an elegant, practiced sympathy that made my stomach turn. "As chief legal counsel, I want to clarify that Sarah's separation from the administrative pool on Tuesday afternoon was handled in strict accordance with our third-quarter efficiency metrics. Sarah has battled severe academic and reading limitations her entire life due to her dyslexia. We have spent years trying to support her within the family structure, but as we prepare for our autumn public offering, having an immediate family member in a low-level secretarial role creates a narrative of nepotism without competence. It looks weak to our institutional backers." A few of the younger board members shifted in their seats, nodding along with Amanda's assessment. My father smiled, a cold, victorious expression settling into his jaw. "Sibling jealousy is a powerful motivator, gentlemen," Julian added, leaning over the table, his eyes finally dropping to meet mine. "But a corporate boardroom is a place for credentials, degrees, and strategic execution. Sarah, I order you to take your portfolio and leave this room before you embarrass yourself any further. Your clearance was revoked 48 hours ago. I looked at my father. I looked at my sister. And for the first time in 28 years, the letters didn't swim. The layout of the room was completely clear. The structural fault line was directly in front of me, and they had walked right onto it. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice coming out level, rhythmic, and entirely devoid of the emotional collapse they were expecting. "I won't be discussing my reading ability today. I won't be discussing sibling jealousy, and I won't be discussing your efficiency metrics. I will, however, be discussing this." I opened my $12 Goodwill portfolio, pulled out the 3 bound copies of the Evelyn Mitchell Heritage Trust Declaration, and slid them across the polished walnut table toward Robert Hartley. "What you are holding, Mr. Chairman," I said, looking directly at Hartley, "is the Master Trust Agreement executed by Evelyn Mitchell on September 12, 2019. It was witnessed by 2 independent notaries and finalized 5 months before her passing. Jonathan, please authenticate the state registry tracking." Jonathan Ellis stepped forward, opening his briefcase and placing a second set of certified documents on the table. "I am Jonathan Ellis, senior partner at Morrison & Blake. I served as Evelyn Mitchell's personal legal counsel for 32 years. I can formally confirm that the 51% majority voting shares of Mitchell Global Enterprises were never passed into Julian Mitchell's personal estate through the standard will. They have been held permanently in escrow by the Heritage Trust since 2019. My father's face completely drained of color. He slammed his palm against the glass table, the sharp crack rattling the water glasses. "This is an absolute fabrication. My mother left me 51% of the voting stock in her primary will. I have voted those shares for 5 years. I run this company." "You voted those shares as a conditional managing trustee, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his roar with an Arctic clarity. "Under Clause 9 of the Master Trust Agreement, your trusteeship was strictly contingent upon maintaining the family protection covenants. The framework explicitly states that if you or any designated successor executed a bad faith termination, systemic marginalization, or formal corporate erasure of any immediate blood descendant of Evelyn Mitchell, without a unanimous board vote and an independent legal audit, your managing power would instantly fail." Amanda stood up, her emerald suit jacket shaking slightly, her perfect corporate mask cracking down the center. "This is legally absurd. A human resources optimization does not trigger a major equity realignment. Even if this ridiculous trust is valid, which our defense firm will contest in court for the next 10 years, Sarah has 0 executive experience. She cannot run a multi-million-dollar real estate firm. She can barely read a spreadsheet." "I don't need to run the operational loop today, Amanda," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "But I do have the majority voting rights to determine who does. Under the bylaws my grandmother established in 1968, the majority shareholder has the immediate right to propose an administrative vote of confidence regarding executive leadership. Mr. Chairman, I am formally introducing that motion now." The room fractured into a chaotic wave of hushed whispers and urgent discussions. Robert Hartley studied the trust documents through his reading glasses, his expression shifting from deep skepticism to a stunned, unshakable gravity. He looked up at my father, then down at the notarized signatures, and finally looked at the board's chief legal consultant, Mr. Patterson, who had been reviewing the state registry on his laptop. "Julian," Hartley said, his voice entirely stripped of its former warmth, "our legal console has confirmed the state registry docket. The Heritage Trust was recorded 6 years ago. The conditional covenants are fully binding under New York estate law. The moment your HR department uploaded Sarah's termination notice on Tuesday afternoon without a board vote, the trusteeship automatically collapsed. The chain of title is clear." Julian collapsed back into his leather chair, his hands trembling as he stared at the document with my name printed on the second line. For the first time in his adult life, my father, a man who had never been at a loss for a decree, had absolutely nothing to say. "Miss Mitchell," Hartley said, looking back down the table toward me with an expression that looked remarkably like respect. "As majority shareholder, the board recognizes your standing to introduce the motion. Is there a second for the vote of no confidence against Julian Mitchell as CEO? Seconded, Margaret Coleman said without a single second of hesitation. Very well, Hartley said, taking a breath. All those expressing confidence in Julian Mitchell's continued tenure as Chief Executive Officer, please raise your hands. 4 hands went up, the junior VPs and old development allies who owed their careers to my father's recommendations. All those expressing no confidence, Hartley countered. 7 hands rose into the air, including Margaret Coleman, Richard Holloway, and Susan Parker. Hartley counted twice, then recorded the metric into the official ledger with a decisive click of his pen. The motion carries 7-4 with 1 abstention, Hartley announced, looking directly into my father's hollow eyes. Julian, per section 14.3 of our operational bylaws, you have 30 days to formally tender your resignation to the board. Amanda, your incoming appointment as CEO is officially suspended pending an independent compliance audit of the administrative pool. Amanda made a choking sound, sinking back into her chair, her fingers clawing at her Cartier bracelet as she stared down at her leather folder. Her perfect, flawless future had just been dismantled in less than 20 minutes by the sister she had tried to erase because it fit the strategic profile. I stood up from my chair, picking up my cheap Goodwill portfolio, my spine perfectly straight, my steps measured. I looked up at my grandmother's portrait above the fireplace. The painted gray eyes seemed to catch the light, and I could almost hear her voice echoing down through the decades. Boundaries are not an act of vengeance, Sarah. They are an act of structure. I will see you all at the next scheduled session, I told the room, looking at my father and sister one final time. Julian, you can keep the 16-week severance package you offered me yesterday. I suggest you use it to find an office that is more suited to your specific pace, but your authority in this tower ends today. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking a sharp, steady metronome against the marble floor of the corridor. I didn't look back, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't need anyone else to tell me where I belonged. 6 months later, the fallout had settled into a quiet, permanent architecture. My father formally resigned from Mitchell Global Enterprises on August 15th, retreating to his suburban estate in upstate New York. He didn't contest the trust in court. Jonathan Ellis had made it completely clear that a public trial would expose the internal financial discrepancies I had mapped from the copy room floor, destroying whatever was left of his premium brand. He spent his days sitting on his manicured lawn, looking at a real estate empire he no longer had the right to vote for. Amanda took a leave of absence from the legal field, entering intensive private therapy in Boston. The golden child armor had completely shattered, leaving behind a 26-year-old girl who had spent her entire life running inside a cage of performance metrics, only to realize that the baseline was built on sand. We met for coffee once, in a quiet, neutral diner in Middletown. It was a stiff, awkward meeting, but when she looked across the Formica table and said, "I'm sorry I didn't look closer, Sarah," I knew the actor had finally left the stage. My mother and I had lunch every other week. It wasn't the warm, idealized relationship promised in luxury television commercials, but it was honest. She was learning to look at me without counting my limitations, and I was learning to control the door. I didn't take the CEO chair at Mitchell Global Enterprises. I never wanted to lead a corporate dynasty from a corner office on the 40th floor. Instead, I established a new division within the firm, the Evelyn Mitchell Sustainable Architecture Initiative. As Director of Development, I used my visual brain to map out green building practices, environmental land acquisitions, and sustainable housing networks across Brooklyn and Queens, commanding a salary of $185,000 a year funded by my own majority dividends. I am sitting at my new desk on the 14th floor of Mitchell Global Tower. It is late Friday evening, and the building outside is perfectly still, wrapped in the quiet hum of the night shift. On my desk sits a framed photograph of my grandmother Evelyn, standing in her small Queens office in 1968, her hands covered in brick dust, her face radiant with choice. Beside the frame rests the heavy mahogany box, its digital latch open, its purpose fully realized. If you are listening to this story right now, and you see yourself sitting at table 27 or standing in the copy room while your family talks over your life, I want you to hear me clearly. Stop waiting for them to change their minds about your worth. They will never give you the approval you are begging for because they need your silence to justify their own volume. See yourself first. Build your boundaries not out of anger, but out of truth. And when they finally turn around to look for the secretary they threw away, let them find a door that you control. That's not revenge, that is architecture.